Hi everyone, AV here. I'm happy to present my Permaflask, Mono-Stacking, Blazing Salvo miner, featuring Original Sin, using Discharge as a secondary skill. If you're a sane PoE player, you probably are thinking the same thing I thought when I first came up with this idea. This build belongs in the PoB Shower Thoughts folder, never to see the light of day. I feel that Original Sin was being used to enhance already strong mechanics or archetypes, rather than create something novel. As I was fortunate enough to self-farm the ring, I sought to venture off the beaten path of the 3.20 meta and make something I think is truly unique. This character does about 70 to 80 million burst non-nearby DPS, with solid survivability and near complete immunity to degens with over 7,000 effective HP recovered per second. Given the specificity and cost of the ring in particular, this is intended to be a build diary and showcase. I do not recommend adoption of this build, since there are several caveats which I will address later on. Original Sin is a new ring released in patch 3.20 that converts all elemental damage to chaos, and sets nearby enemy chaos resistance to 0. This means that different types of elemental damage are effectively additive, and have 30% or more chaos penetration without curses. It also has access to a massive damage bonus via Wither, which is easy to apply this patch for a balance of terror. Our build takes advantage of this ubiquitous elemental scaling using the Mono Miner archetype, which was first popularized by Kane back in 3.12, but fell out of popularity due to multiple auras being near mandatory for defenses in recent patches. This life-based archetype scales both offense and defense simultaneously by stacking mana, which I'll elaborate on later in this video. Offense revolves around Arcane Cloak, a mana-based guard skill. It consumes a large percentage of your mana on use, a cost that does not change with cost of skills modifiers. It grants a large flat lightning damage bonus to both spells and attacks over its duration, as long as the buff remains on your character. We take advantage of this large fixed mana cost by using Indigon, which grants a spell damage bonus that scales with total mana spent over the last 4 seconds. Indigon also increases skill cost, but Arcane Cloak is not affected due to its unique wording. With both flat and percentage damage scaling, quadratic scaling with mana forms the basis of this character archetype, which really hasn't changed much since its inception. Credit to Akane and other build creators for popularizing this particular interaction. Mines are an ideal choice for this character archetype for several reasons. First, mine throwing speed can scale much faster than cast speed with relatively low investment, augmenting an additional scaling vector for little cost. Second, mines can be pre-stacked to take advantage of Arcane Cloak's relatively short duration, during which a large amount of burst damage can be output. Blazing Salvo was chosen since we don't really care about the skill's damage type, but only its mechanics, due to Original Sin. I chose this skill by feel since it has good damage effectiveness per use, and fast Wither application, but I'm sure there's skill optimization to be made here. We further improve damage scaling by stacking numerous additive and multiplicative mechanics. We take advantage of Ascendant's passive tree flexibility by using the synergy between Elegant Hubris and Impossible Escape. We grab a total of 210% damage from Frenzy and Power Charges, 160% increased minion damage, and 40% crit multi at the opportunity cost of 6 passive points and 2 jewel sockets, for an average of around 5.8% more damage per passive point. This is in part due to using Badge of the Brotherhood instead of the more popular Aziri's Foible, since this build benefits more from stacking charges than the additional mana. We stack up the 7 power and 7 frenzy charges, which give us additional scaling through the power charge wheel at Witch, and the inherent more damage multiplier from frenzy charges. This also scales charged mine support, giving additional throwing speed and crit chance per frenzy and power charge, respectively. We support Arcane Cloak with Arcane Surge, and stack 75% Arcane Surge effect through passive tree and Hierophant Ascendancy, granting us a 39% more multiplier. We also support Arcane Cloak with increased duration, rather than the more common Enhance, as Arcane Surge inherits increased duration and results in a 10-second Arcane Surge, which is 100% uptime. We run Righteous Fire for another 40% more damage since our effective recovery is incredibly high. We also have Zealotry on Divine Blessing, which we get to cast for free due to Lavianga's Spirit, a mechanic which I'll touch on later. This character's unique twist on the mana stacking archetype comes from a set of unique interactions between charges, generic damage scaling, mana, Original Sin, and the unique gloves Khaleesi's Grace. We generate charges through charged mines, as each detonated mine with anomalous charged mines has a 40% chance of independently generating frenzy and power charges. Original Sin allows us to stack any elemental damage type since it's all converted to chaos, and gains a massive 135% more multiplier through Wither. Khaleesi's Grace gives us 2% base crit strike for 2 seconds if we spend 800 mana, which synergizes with the mana archetype. Furthermore, since it's a non-meta unique, double corrupted versions with +2 or +3 to gem level are easily accessible. Since we only scale generic damage, we can use any self-cast skill. Additionally, we get a lot of free critical strike, chance, and multi from the successive detonations notable, which gives generic bonuses for any skill. We socket a 4-link Discharge in these gloves, which also benefits from the 18 level faster casting inherent to the gloves to provide a massive, quick cast, single target damage nuke on bosses. With incredibly high base damage from charges, single damage type conversion, and massive percentage damage scaling, we've created a scenario where Discharge is actually a viable secondary skill. And who doesn't like explosions? Defensively, we try compensating for the lack of physical mitigation and damage avoidance by stacking Flask Effect and Recovery. Progenesis, introduced this patch, converts a percentage of hit damage taken to life to damage over time instead, which synergizes extremely well with Mind Over Matter. This is largely because life-based mana stackers often have mana to life ratios much larger than the optimal ratio determined by damage taken from mana before life modifiers. Progenesis allows us to approach the optimal ratio, fully utilizing our mana pool to soak large hits. Please see Sergeant Miner's video for additional details, which I'll link below. We also stack both Taste of Hate and a Ruby Flask, providing additional fire and cold damage mitigation. We use a Fractured Horror Essence chest for additional fizz damage conversion to cold, for a total of 39% physical to cold conversion. The Pathfinder Ascendancy allows us to permanently sustain flasks even on bosses, so these bonuses have 100% uptime. Sigil of Power reduces damage of enemies in its radius, but this is highly unreliable for most bosses due to bosses teleporting. Finally, Arcane Cloak provides a somewhat large but inconsistent damage buffer, raising our EHP during its uptime of around 55%. We achieve 100% elemental ailment avoidance through our shield and boots. Due to our itemization and passive tree pathing, however, we only get around 50% spell suppression, which I find acceptable only because this build's mechanics create so much unique item pressure. This number can be raised up to 77% with the addition of Raider Ascendancy jewels and grabbing Magebane on our Sanctified Relic. Extremely high recovery is achieved through Indigon's ability to allow Mana Flask recovery to also apply to your life pool. Mana Flask recovery is scaled through a combination of mana recovered from flasks, Flask Effect duration, Flask Effect, mana recovery rate, and Mana Flask recovery. This is largely achieved with a combination of cluster jewel passives and a belt tailored for this build specifically. The Veiled or Crafted Flask Effect mod is not ideal in this case, since it penalizes flask uptime too heavily compared to the regular Flask Effect prefix. I won't go into the mathematical details of optimizing Mana Flask recovery rate, but note that as a rule of thumb, that you want to stack as many unique sources affecting Mana Flask recovery, prioritizing recovery rate whenever you have the item mod slot to do so. Most importantly, we get sources of reduced flask charges used to go from 7 charges per use to 5 charges per use on our Lavianga's Spirit, which is a massive boon for boss fights when mana recovery is needed extremely often. This results in a recovery rate of around 4,000 per second for up to 5 seconds while Lavianga's Spirit is active. Note that this flask is not enduring, so one caveat of this build is reacting to damage by activating the flask in order to recover. If timed correctly, this flask provides upwards of 8,000 effective HP recovery per second. This recovery, combined with the inherent recovery of Agnostic, makes it incredibly easy to react against damage over time effects and smaller hits, since our mana pool degenerates much faster than our life pool when hit. The reason why we use Laviangas instead of an Enduring Flask is that it allows us to bypass the main disadvantage of Indigon during its effect. Our mana costs are 0, which allows us to throw mines at a much faster rate than our recovery would otherwise allow. We can also cast Divine Blessing with no downside, of which we can extend the duration through support gems and passive tree, resulting in a 26-second aura for quality of life. We also take advantage of a seldom exploited stat in mana builds, chance to recover 10% of your mana pool when you use a skill. We stack up to 25% of this stat through Watcher's Eye and passive tree. Detonate Mines counts as a skill with a 0.2 second cooldown, so just off this alone we have around 875 effective mana regen per second, meaning that we can sustain max mana much more easily without using a flask. Since we have inherent mana recovery not tied to flask or regen, we boost our mana using Chevron's Revelation to easily achieve 7,000 mana without Cloak of Defiance or Adziri's Foible. The lack of regen caused by Chevrons doesn't affect us in any way, since we recover mana through the mana pool recovery effect I just discussed. While this build has solid damage and recovery on paper, there are several major caveats to be aware of. First, is that timing the damage window is very player skill dependent, since you have to time Khaleesi's Grace buff, Indigon's spell damage bonus, and Arcane Cloak uptime, all the while being aware of mine placement. Furthermore, Discharge has a 0.37 cast time even after all the cast speed increases, making it possible to be stunned out of its animation since we don't grab stun immunity. Second is that the recovery window also requires anticipation of incoming damage and reactive timing with the Mana Flask. Arcane Cloak is also incredibly inconsistent in dense maps without sources of damage avoidance like evasion, since small but frequent hits destroy the shield and corresponding damage bonus in seconds. Lastly, in order to fully take advantage of Alchemist's genius, flasks should be offset in timings for boss invitations or arenas to maintain close to full uptime without too much hassle. If you made it this far, thanks for taking the time to listen to my short ramblings on this build's mechanics and intricacies. I know it's a lot to take in, especially if you're unfamiliar with the mechanics, but I wouldn't have been able to put this together without the numerous contributions of players who discovered many of the small interactions described above. Special thanks to my friend Brian for throwing out the crazy idea for Discharge, from which the rest of the build constructed itself. If you have additional questions, please post below or at my Reddit account, YouButsicles. I'll end this video with the rest of this Uber Adziri fight. Thanks again, and I'll see you all in the next one.